again, and good evening, everybody, once again. It's no secret, of course, that my favourite preacher is Martyn Lloyd-Jones, and one of his most famous series ever was called Spiritual Depression. And he spent weeks going through the subject of spiritual depression and diagnosing what he called the mumps and measles of the soul. And he finished that series, and he got up the next Sunday and he said, we've been dealing with this great and important subject of spiritual depression. The mumps and measles of the soul. And then he goes, and if I may say, I think we rather enjoyed ourselves. His point being, of course, that they were talking about themselves for weeks on end. And he said, now we're going to get on with something that is less attractive, which is we're going to talk about God. Now, unfortunately, that's not the way it should be. But as human beings, that's so often the way that we approach these things. We do quite enjoy reflecting on ourselves. We enjoy a little less sometimes reflecting on God. We're going to turn that around. We should turn that around. Today, I'm not going to talk about identity. I'm not going to talk about the image of God. I'm going to talk about something far more important, which is I am going to talk about some broader themes. And Dan has read you a pretty heavy chapter from the Bible, and that's what I'm going to base a lot of what I say on. He read to you from verse 16 through to 32. And you will remember that it started in verse 16 with a very well-known verse, which is, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, or from faith beginning to end, for as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Now, that is a statement of the answer. The Apostle Paul writes a lot like many of us learn to write at school, which is that you often had a thesis and you had topic sentences, and then you would go through and prove those points that you made up front. That's Paul's style. He makes a point up front, he hits you between the eyes with it, and then he goes and explains himself and proves it. That is actually the thesis of the whole book of Romans. He puts that there, and then the rest of the book is explaining it. That means that from verse 18, you start to get a statement of the problem which that solves. The problem statement goes through chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. And he starts in chapter 1 by describing what is the problem with the world at large. What's the problem with culture, with society, at a broad level. And by chapter 3, the laser sights are focused right in, and he says, you too, by the way. And then he gets very personal in chapter 3. So here we are in starting from verse 18 initially, and we'll come back to the solution later. This is the problem statement for society at large. And this is, in a nutshell, what the Apostle Paul says is wrong with our world. And the reason I'm going through this is I want us to get some understanding of the state of the nation, the state of our culture, before we get to the answer. And this is what Paul's talking about. And here's his succinct statement of it, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Let's break it down. What's the problem? Well, God's wrath is the problem, but notice that it's not the future. When we hear that phrase, we think of the future, judgment. No, he says it is being revealed. That's literally what he says here. So it's already here. So that's what's wrong with the world, is that you've got the wrath of God being revealed now in the world. And you say, oh gosh, why? Well, first of all, he says the reason is ungodliness. In other words, people have rejected God. That's all that means. They don't know the living God. They're ungodly. And then he says, therefore, as a result of that, what follows? Unrighteousness. What is righteous? Righteous is what God says is right. Therefore, if you reject God, you're very quickly going to reject his ways. You're very quickly going to go your own way and run according to your own point of reference. And so that's why you see in the world unrighteousness, because they've rejected God. And then he says, but it doesn't finish there. He says, actually, the real problem, or part of the real problem, is that people persist in this endeavour. They go on suppressing the truth. That's what it says. In unrighteousness. In other words, they keep doing the wrong thing to hold down the truth about God. That's quite a significant thing to say about the world. But you see the order. The Apostle Paul's always very orderly. Every word is in the right spot. That's because he was such an educated guy, and that's the way he had learned. Now, therefore we've got God's wrath because of ungodliness, which yields unrighteousness, and therefore a pattern of truth suppression, ongoing truth suppression about God. So here's the question. In this constellation of problems that Paul is observing with the world, he's about to prove it. He's just stating it up front for now. What is the biggest issue? What is the primary issue with the world, according to Paul? Well, the primary issue really is this condition called ungodliness. And we must never forget that the first and the primary problem with the world, with Australia, with this city, with the culture and the society that we're in, the first and primary problem is a spiritual problem. And that's never going to change before Jesus returns. The problem the world actually has is that they have rejected God. The problem that people actually have is that they do not know the living God. The problem, to use an old-fashioned phrase, so we think it is now, but it's still the problem, people are not saved. Full stop, end of story. Quaint and antiquated, but it's the truth. That's always the issue. There are really no other problems beyond that problem. That's really the start, that's the colossus, that's the elephant in the room. That is the fountainhead of all of our problems. And here's the thing, it's unique in that it's an eternal problem. It's a problem that goes from this life into the next, into the future. It has consequences forever. The reason I single this out is I want to make a point for all of us, is that this is why the gospel of Jesus Christ must always be at the heart of what we do in our lives. Always. A lot of people, and this is the typical social cultural commentary that you will see, especially conservative social cultural commentary, they don't ever get beyond unrighteousness. They say, look at all the stuff that's wrong with the world. And it's very reactionary, and it's always pointing out the fools and the idiots and this and that and the dumb things and the bad ideas and the dodgy philosophies. And all of their solutions to that unrighteousness, they never go beyond this world's solutions. They never actually go beyond social solutions or education solutions, just teach people more of this kind of values, or a philosophical solution, let's promote a different philosopher, not Marx, somebody else. Or a political solution, if only the right party was in the ascendancy, and if only the right faction within that party was in the ascendancy, we'd have so much solved, wouldn't we? And you see the whole world is caught up in these non-spiritual answers to what is actually a spiritual problem. That's honestly why I started the truth of it, actually, because I got so tired of people, even Christians, not just fessing up and saying, actually, I'm a Christian and here's the answer, because it is the answer. Now, social issues, political issues, educational issues, talking about things you hear, we just need to have a conversation about this issue. Now, look, I don't want to completely denigrate those things. I'm saying they're not sufficient. They're not the whole answer. Now, they have their place, of course, but they're never going to finally solve the problem with the world. They're never going to finally solve the problem, which is people's relationship to God or lack thereof. The order is that deliberate. It plays out in real life as unrighteousness because of ungodliness. Now, the problem we have, of course, is that there is a lot of pressure to offer the world something better than the gospel. There's a lot of pressure to offer something more sophisticated than the gospel. You will find time and again, like I said, people need to get saved. Well, that's such an old-fashioned idea. Don't you have something to give culture? Don't you have something to advance the well-being and the welfare of the individual? Don't you have something to meet the academia of the day? That's the sort of pressure that comes against the Christian. And of course, Christians, they then shy away from what is basic and fundamental and say, actually, the Christian duty in the world is cultural transformation. Or the Christian duty in the world, here's a phrase you might hear, is redeeming culture. Can I just say something about that? Culture doesn't redeem, people redeem. Redemption's for people, not things. People will talk about the contemporary issues, global politics. What's the Christian answer to all of these things? There'll be a sense that it's a little unhelpful to be overly gospel-minded. You need to really bring into the public squares these other more sophisticated things. And that's really where the Christians should be, and they should focus on those things. Political solutions, cultural solutions, etc. One of the phrases I've heard is, stop being so heavenly minded that you know earthly good. I've got to say, I have never in all my life met a single person who has that problem. It usually has the opposite effect. There was a big emphasis for a long time on vocation. To say, stop talking about evangelism. We need to affirm the fact that Christians have vocations in this world, and those vocations are really actually primarily important to those people. So let's focus on that. Again, I'm not actually saying that there's no place for any of that. But I am saying, as we get pushed towards the world's demands, which is a concern for the here and now, it's a concern for the secular life under the sun. It's a concern for the needs and wants of the day. That's really the world's perspective on these things. It's ungodly, it's without God. And as we try, and as we exist in that world, and as we do good in that world, as we ought to, the thing is to keep our perspective. And the thing is to keep our perspective that actually the thing that really is wrong with the world is that every soul needs salvation. And that's never going to change so long as this world continues. And the greatest mission you will ever have in this world, no matter who you are, no matter where you work, no matter what your life consists in, the greatest mission you will have is evangelism. As I say, other things, of course, matter. And I think that the jobs that we're given to do, the vocations to which we're called, for example, what's my primary focus? I'm in an area of politics, right? Well, what's the point of that, you might say? Well, God does have a plan for politics. But here's the other thing. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, you hear that we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. And the faithful completion of those good works to which we're called is something we're supposed to do in our life. And I'm sure it will be rewarded in the fullness of time. You can think of something like the parable of the talents, where the servants are given the circumstances, the means, the talents, the resources to do work. And there are those that do it faithfully. And what's the thing that's said to them? Well done, good and faithful servant. But see, all of those things that come up in our lives in terms of our vocations, in terms of our calling, in terms of our day-to-day, they differ between us all. Each of us finds ourselves in a different spot with a different task at hand in the secular terms. But there is one thing which is not different for every person. There's one thing that is the same for every person. And the one thing that is the same for every person is evangelism. If you're in politics, you need to be evangelizing in politics as much as you're doing the work of politics. If you're in an office block, you need to be evangelizing in the office block as much as you're doing the paperwork that comes your way. If you're in the scientific world writing papers about science, well, you need to be evangelizing professors and colleagues as much as you are writing those papers and contributing to the work of science in the world. See, there's something that's consistent, that's the same for everybody. Because the Great Commission is first evangelistic. And also when Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, he says, you're the light of the world. And he's saying this to ordinary folks. He's surrounded by the flotsam and jetsam of the society and people who had trades and all the rest of it. And he just says to them, look, you are the light of the world. But what's the point of being the light of the world? So that people may glorify your Father who's in heaven. And the point is to lead them to God. That's the thing that is common between us. And it's interesting, you know, I mentioned all those talents and gifts that you're given and the place that God puts you and the things he leads you into. You can often use those things to the end of pointing people to God as well. That is very possible to do. And indeed, I think, I mean, here's something to consider in those vocations and what you do and the circumstances you've been placed. Consider that actually what you've been given is not really yours at all. God's given you your talents and your gifts and your circumstances. It's like you're actually holding them on trust and you're supposed to use them for him. And it doesn't matter, you might be a highly intellectual person, you might have incredible academic results. That's a gift from God. It's not yours. There's nothing more foolish than to be prideful in your intellect because it's not even yours. God gave it to you. Or it might be the case that you're somebody who, you know, some people have favour. There are some people, everybody just loves them. It's not people who just compromise or, you know, who, you know, obsequious people. Not those people. People who don't do any of that, but they just are so favoured wherever they go. It's interesting, you read the life of Joseph and Daniel, God gave them favour. It says it over and over again. God gave Daniel favour with the chief eunuch. God gave Daniel favour with the king's servant and so on. Joseph as well, favour with the jailer. That's God's doing. If you're somebody that gets favour everywhere you go, it's not because you're so great, it's because God's given you a gift. And that's something you can use. Do you know, here's another thing, beauty is a gift from God. Do you know how many people have shipwrecked their lives because they were too beautiful? How stupid is that? You look at someone like Esther, who used beauty as God gave it to her for good. I mean, that's again something that God has given you on trust to use. I mean, these are all blessings, these are all giftings, and we're all different in this respect. And here's the thing, the idea is that you have those talents and you use them to multiply for good in the kingdom of God. And Jesus will say to you, well done, good and faithful servant, for doing the good works he gave you and for never forgetting the thing that's common to us all. Let's make sure we never stop with the evangelism. We never stop pointing people to the gospel, pointing people to Christ. Now you might say, well, that's daunting. And I think it is daunting. I find it, believe it or not, I'm good at big talk, but I'm not very good at small talk. I've never been a conversationalist, and I've never actually been a very social kind of person. So it's actually really, but it's hard for me to, you know, I have a friend, actually one of my best mates, and whenever I go anywhere with this guy, we end up talking to random people for hours. And we have the waitress sitting at the table after closing time talking about like pork belly. And you're sitting there going, this doesn't happen to me. You know, or he'll go into a clothing shop and then he'll be talking to the bloke who'll then take him downstairs to his tailor workshop and talk to him about fabric styles. And 2 hours later, he hasn't even bought anything, but they're getting on like a house on fire. And I said to him, what is your secret, man? Like, people don't do this to me. You know, I walk around and people turn the other way. It's just a completely different environment. And you sit there and you go, hang on, how in the world do some of us get into situations where we can talk to someone about the gospel, let alone the stress that that can cause? Now, let me say a couple of things on that. The first one is, it doesn't necessarily start with words. One of the most important things to square up when we're young is to be the kind of person that people do meet and look at and go, there's something different about you. And God can do that for you. If you are living the Christian life, and you know, it can even be as simple as the way you speak. I worked in petrol stations when I was at university for some time. It was a pretty rough and tumble kind of crowd. And the thing that people noticed first was, you don't talk dirty. It was the most obvious thing. And that actually led them to ask further questions. I mean, how simple is that? The way we conduct ourselves is crucial. I heard a story about a lady who was she was a cleaner in a hospital. And she was a cleaner in that hospital for years. And she was a very under-the-radar person. She was somebody that people didn't tend to notice. She was in there after hours, and she actually had a sense that, you know, work is just work, and I get home and I do more important things. And after about 10 years in this hospital, as she was leaving one evening, one of the surgeons who was working there said to her, "Now listen," he said, "I've been watching you." And he said, "What is it about you?" And she clammed up and was like, what do I say? And she said, "Jesus Christ," and walked out. And that surgeon became a Christian. And the reason I know that story is because I was listening to his testimony. And he said the difference in her life got him thinking and got him started. So don't underestimate what God actually can do. Here's another thing to do, but you've got to be prepared to follow through on it. If you do worry that you don't get opportunities, pray for opportunities. I had this happen to me in a remarkable way. I had a moment where I was thinking, gee, I'm working around other Christians. I'm rubbing shoulders all day in the office with Christians. How can I have, and a lot of people around the place sort of identify who you are and react to you on that basis. And I thought, how can I have an ordinary conversation with someone? How can I have these random happenstance relationships and evangelize? And I prayed that I'd have an opportunity. Do you know, I went for a walk one evening at 9 p.m. in the rain, and I came across a man who was in the process of committing suicide. This was here in Canberra. And I was on the top of one of the local hills, and it was cold as anything, late, and I got over the hill and there was a guy with a noose, and he was standing on a stool, and he was ready to go. And I thought, whoa. Anyway, I turned like this, I said a quick prayer, and then I just walked over to him. And I said, "Oh, lovely evening." I said I couldn't help but notice that you're standing up on that stool. Can I ask what's going on? I said I wasn't good at small talk, all right? And this guy said, "What does it look like?" And we ended up talking on the top of that hill for hours. And I thought, well, this is the sort of situation where you've got nothing to lose. And so I said, have you thought about God? And he went, "Ugh," like this. And he said, "I come from a Christian family." And we talked for 4 hours until 1 o'clock in the morning about all this stuff. Here's the thing, right? Why on earth did I do the stupid thing of going for a walk at 9 o'clock at night in the rain, in the bush? It's not something I usually do. So I don't know why I did it. I just got up and thought, I'm going for a walk. I just think I was meant to be there. It's just what God answers prayers when you say your prayers. But you've got to be prepared. Sometimes the answer comes. But also I want to say this. Sometimes you do muck it up. And it's, just pray for another go. God's merciful. He knows that we fail sometimes. Do you know, one of the things that, really launched ACL's profile 3 years ago was the Israel Folau thing. I had 2 cracks at that. The first time Folau posted something on his social media and Channel 7 rang, I said I wouldn't do the interview. And afterwards, I reflected on that and I thought that was wrong. I thought, you gutless, lily-livered little coward. And I prayed and I said, "Lord, forgive me." I said no, and I should have said yes. 6 months later, the phone rang again, and this time it was Channel 10, the project. And I thought, well, I know what I've got to say. I've got to say yes. God gives you a second chance sometimes. And here's the other thing, even when we do mess it up, I heard another testimony. I was in Western Sydney at a church, and there were 2 people getting baptised, and one guy got up, his name was Burke, I think. He was Malaysian, I think. Let's say Malaysian. And he was working in New Zealand. He was a Buddhist. And he was working in New Zealand, and while he was there at his office, he was just sitting at his desk one evening, working away late. And a very awkward colleague of his walked up to the desk and was kind of obviously nervous. And sort of Burke says to him, "What's up?" And he goes, "Burke, I just want you to know you're a sinner and you're going to hell." Burke went, "Okay." And then this guy got flummoxed and walked off. I kind of have this vision of this guy sitting there going, "Man, I'm an idiot. What am I doing? I shouldn't have even tried." do you know something? Burke went home that very night and he walked in the door and he had a massive argument with his wife. Anyway, they slammed the door and all the rest of it. It was all, he was angry. Anyway, he then went and sat down on the end of his bed. And all of a sudden he heard the guy saying, "You're a sinner and you're going to hell." And he thought, wow, I think it's true. Because he felt so wretched about the interaction he'd had. And he said he couldn't get this idea out of his head to such an extent that he actually started to seek. He prayed that God reveal himself. He found a church, all the rest of it. And he was getting baptised in Western Sydney about 18 months ago when I was in this church. So, even when you don't get it quite right, God can still use a witness and a testimony. I think really it's the condition of the heart that matters more than anything. That's why one of the things we must not get in the habit of doing is looking at, I think John Steenhoff made this reference this morning, is looking at the way someone has done something and saying, "Oh, well, I wouldn't have done it like that. I would have been more nuanced, and, that's a little bit crude. And why did he post a meme that wasn't very graphically, sound? Some graphic design principles would have been good." And, I even saw a whole article on the fact with Izzy Folau that he said hell awaits. Well, hell doesn't await. You can't give hell a personality. And so this whole academic piece, and I was like, oh, for heaven's sake. We've got to really not get into the zone of saying, oh, well, they didn't do it precisely the way I did it. Because here's the thing. One day it might be your day in the sun. And do you know what? You'll find you didn't do it perfectly. And if they repeat what you said and did over and over and over and over again, you might even start to feel pretty small about it. And people might be able to criticise you about it, because not one of us is perfect. I just want to make the point that God undertakes for that stuff. And so I want to plant in our mind the seed this evening that the vocation that we all have is to be evangelists. And it probably is the case that you end up where you end up because God means you to be an evangelist in that context, as much as he means you to do the good works that he's given you to do in the vocation that he's given you. And the two things are quite connected most of the time. Now, let's move on. Having said all of that, I want to just help us understand the state of our culture. I want to ask what is wrong with the world. We've already said the world doesn't know the living God, but Romans 1 tells us how that plays out in practice. And one of the things it says about how we see this played out in practice is that phrase that we read earlier, which is that they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. There's a very strong point here in the whole chapter, in fact. And it's actually that people aren't just ignorant of God. The Apostle Paul makes the startling claim that people actively resist God. He makes the startling claim that actually continuing ungodliness is a deliberate act and an ongoing act. And it's part of a fallen human nature that people resist God on an ongoing basis. Now that's a big claim. And Paul knows that, so he actually goes on to prove it. And he begins with this point. He says that society, if you look closely, you will see that it is engaged in an ongoing enterprise of truth suppression. Because truth always points people to God, because all truth is God's truth. And people typically resist reminders of God if they are indeed involved in the business of an ongoing suppression of the truth about God. Now, if that's true, we'd expect to see it in our day, and we do. Consider a few areas. Consider firstly, I've got a few things. There's firstly the general problem of thoughtlessness, the fact that people won't grapple with truth because they won't think. Or there is, in fact, the fact that the way people live is so often geared towards the suppression of truth. But there is also the fact that our political systems and philosophies of our time really suppress truth. A lot of people try and tie these phenomena together in all different ways. For example, cancel culture. They say that's a matter of freedom of speech. It is. But you will find that the people who get cancelled are the people who tell the truth 99 times in 100. Isn't that interesting? Truth is actually the thing that holds together so much of what we see playing out in our day. People who tell lies on a lot of these trendy issues, they don't really face the same kind of resistance. Let me show you some examples. Let me firstly deal with the fact that we live in a thoughtless age. I was having a conversation with someone over lunch yesterday about this very thing. I worked in a big law firm for a while. I don't mean to discourage any hopeful lawyers here. It was pretty depressing. Working in an office, it's just not my thing to work in a white beige office, for long hours every day, shuffling papers around. It was awful. And the most exciting thing that happened in a day was that, you sort of go for your lunch break. You're like, oh, having sushi today. Want to come get some sushi? And that's kind of it. Like it was pretty grueling. And it is when you're junior in these big law firms. But one of the things that I kind of couldn't understand about my colleagues was that they would work like dogs Monday to Friday. There'd be people who fell asleep on the floor and got up the next morning and kept going. Some of the stuff they had to do was intense. And then, of course, what happens? 1 minute to 5 on a Friday afternoon, the bottles are already coming out of the fridge. And then they just, they don't know who they are from Friday afternoon till Monday morning. They go and party hard, they drink until they, completely blind drunk, and they wake up where they don't even know where they are, and they lose their handbags and their phones and all this kind of stuff. And they come back to work on Monday morning, laugh about all the things they can't remember, and rinse and repeat. I used to think, is it me? Like, what the heck is going on here? They will deny it to their dying day, but there is no greater evidence just in the life of some people, how that they suppress the truth about God in unrighteousness on an ongoing basis. Do you know what that is? It's a life of thoughtlessness. And drug and alcohol culture, what it does is it puts you out of your mind. I remember yesterday we were talking about the fact that God puts us in our right mind. The Christian should never have any part in that kind of stuff. But that is the culture of the world. That's a good time, is to be out of your mind, not to think, not to be serious, not to face facts, to check out of reality, not face reality. There's a verse on this, 1 Corinthians 6:12. I saw a Q&A where someone asked a pastor if it was okay to smoke pot. And he said, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of anything. It's very important. There's something else that you'll see, and I've noticed this big time in recent years, the rise of the inane and the foolish. You know how hard it is to get videos that actually talk about important stuff to get traction on the internet? The stuff that rates, it's like animal rescue videos, ASMR. What the heck is that? Or react videos. You get some bimbo in the corner like, at whatever's going on the screen. It's like people are watching this for ages. These things have like 25 million views. Dance moves, that's what TikTok is all about, fails. And anything sexual or lewd or suggestive will always rate off the charts. It's occurred to me, this is what people are spending their lives doing. And can I just say a warning, particularly to younger guys, browsing YouTube back to back for 6 hours at a time is doing you no good. Now, girls do it as well, I know, but being a guy, I know that it's particularly an issue. It's a thoughtlessness. It's a time evaporator. There's a failure to confront the things that really matter. Pop culture and entertainment, this is really particularly nasty because what it does to us is that through not thinking, our thinking is shaped. Isn't that weird? Through being entertained, we're trained to think differently. This is an area that really can be destructive. And I just want to say, we know that so many bad ideas have actually come into our world and have gained acceptance through pop culture. The wholesale destruction of the family and the denigration of the traditional family really is almost an agenda in Hollywood and all the rest of it, and entertainment and all that. The way family relationships are depicted so often is just all-out argument. They just scream at each other all the time, and dads are always losers. and all this kind of stuff. That's actually, growing up, we weren't allowed to watch The Simpsons. And it wasn't until recently that Dad told us why he wouldn't let us watch The Simpsons. And he said it was because of Homer. He said because he was a loser and he actually denigrated fathers. And you had this fat, beer-guzzling loser who had no respect from his family, who had no brains and didn't try to have any brains, who was ruled by his wife. And he said it was just all wrong. And so he wouldn't let us watch The Simpsons. But here's the thing, that kind of stuff, through not thinking, it shapes our thinking. And that's actually a very low-level example. We know that it gets far worse. We really ought not to allow ourselves to be entertained by things that don't accord with biblical standards. And indeed, we shouldn't allow things to entertain us on a screen that we wouldn't allow to entertain us in the middle of this room, in reality. It's very important. But you see, again, it's a thoughtless time, and it's a time by which people are even indoctrinated by not thinking. It's extraordinary. But there's more than that. It's not just thoughtlessness, a failure to confront the serious and to confront realities. There really is something else. By the way, here's another one, actually. What are the two things people want to talk about the least? What are the two death?
Politics and religion.
Yes, politics and religion, and death is one as well. I was going to say politics and religion, but yes, death. These are things that, if you sit down at a dinner party and you want to talk about any one of those three things, it's just like, no. Can you imagine sitting on a train and trying to talk to somebody, try and talk about anything spiritual? That's not the thing they want to talk about. It's almost like there's this inbuilt opposition in people to those very subjects which define meaning, which grapple with truth. But there's another, and it goes through to the cultural level as well. It goes through to the political level. John spoke to us this morning. And I'm grateful that he did because I don't have to rehearse so much of the material. But John spoke to us about the cases he's dealing with. That girl who wrote to her university about the Ida Hobbit Day? That's another example where you're like, well, I wouldn't write it quite like that. But hey, she had a crack, right? And here's the thing. The reaction against her was completely demented and out of proportion because she was suspected of believing a certain thing. It was actually that she was suspected of believing a certain thing. And what was that certain thing? Well, it was the truth. That's what she was suspected of believing in. Or what about the Melbourne doctor who had the investigation launched against his, 14 odd years of social media history? Why did they choose him? And what issues did they take issue with? Well, it was things like abortion, it was things like gender, it was all the stuff about which he wrote articles and he commented on where he told truth about these things. And what was the conclusion? Well, you're not safe for patients if you believe these things. What really is the target? Is it speech? No, it's not speech, it's truth. Byron and Kira, did he do the one about the foster parents? Did he tell you about them? The real issue the foster agency had, you go to that foster agency's homepage and they've got they've got the same-sex couples there with kids, so they're not concerned about some beliefs, some family structures, but they are concerned about Byron and Kira's beliefs. Why Byron and Kira's beliefs? Well, they're true beliefs. This is the only way I can square this up. Case upon case upon case upon case. 99 out of 100, the issue is the truth. Every single time. I'm actually being sued at the moment. And one of the reasons I'm being sued is that I completely by accident used the wrong pronouns to describe somebody in a video. I can't remember what I said now, but I think I said she when it is supposed to be he. Well, according to the complainant, it's supposed to be he. I had no clue. No, it's supposed to be they. I should get it right, shouldn't I? Goodness gracious. Only being sued for it. But again, what went wrong there? Well, actually, the pronouns I used, they reflected the truth about the person. I only used those pronouns because I knew something about them. And so it was a logical assumption. Cancel culture is so often, nearly always, directed against truth. Now, how do you explain that, honestly? other than the fact that we have a spiritual problem. I mean, that's the connecting power here. That's the explanatory force. And of course, that's what the Apostle Paul says. Most cultural commentators won't, but Paul had no shame, so he said it. Legislative reforms, just think about this as well. Some of the biggest issues we've been grappling with lately are things which, well, let me put it this way. In Timothy, the Apostle Paul says, pray for kings and governing authorities that we might lead peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness. So he's basically saying, pray for the freedom for us as Christians to live and exist in relation to the government. And he says, because God desires all people everywhere to come to a knowledge of the truth and be saved. In other words, he's saying, hey, if we're free, the truth will be free, right? That's the goal. Well, that's one of the things that he's implying in that statement. And it's just occurred to me that so much of the legislative reform we see at the moment is directed against people coming to a knowledge of the truth. You can think of the conversion therapy laws that are passed, say, in Victoria. Really, the main effect of those, there being no conversion therapy of the kind the movies depict in the modern era, really the effect of those laws is going to be to give parents a real headache. If you're a Christian parent, for example, and you want to encourage your child to live according to their biological sex, which is good, right, and important, and the cost of the opposite is rather severe, all of a sudden you've got a problem on your hands if they start to question you. Real problem. If you're a pastor and someone wants to come to you for counselling about these issues, you're in real trouble. Hey, if you're a medical professional who just happens to believe the truth about these things, especially if you're a Christian, if you're Dr. Jareth, what do? You're in real trouble. What's the thing? Well, it's an opposition to the knowledge of the truth. People can't actually impart the truth about the human person through their medicine, through their families. It's a huge problem. Or what about legislative changes to equal opportunity laws? It's interesting to me that the singular focus has really been on Christian schools. There was a federal bill that was just Christian schools. There's a Victorian bill that's going to mostly affect Christian schools. To say what? Well, a Christian school, it's going to be a lot harder for them to employ Christian staff. Now, if you don't have Christian staff, you don't really have a Christian school, do you? It just goes without saying. So what they're doing is undermining the Christianity of the Christian schools by a slightly back door. And you sit there and go, well, why are they so bothered about Christian schools? Why don't they leave them alone? Well, the Christian school I went to, there was a couple of guys in my grade who were not Christians when they started and not from Christian families, and they were Christians when they graduated. And indeed, one of them is a pastor of a major church in Brisbane right now. Now, that's why they want to go for Christian schools. It's the truth. What else explains the choices here? There is an opposition to the knowledge of the truth. Before I leave this topic, I just want to point out that there are a couple of ideologies that are around at the moment which fit this description, and they're very dominant ones. One you might think about, for example, is what is often called cultural Marxism. And people disagree over whether that's the right term. Whether it's cultural Marxism or a collection of three other things that mean the same thing, I don't know. But let's call it cultural Marxism. Or indeed, let's call it woke. It's really interesting to me, and the penny really dropped recently, that this ideology targets a particular kind of truth wherever it is found. It targets creation. So what is oppression? Well, heteronormativity is oppression, right? In other words, boys are boys, girls are girls, boys like girls like boys, they get married, they have children. That's terrible oppression. This is where we are, and you need to liberate people from the shackles of heteronormativity. That's what Ros Ward would say. She's a speaker at the Marxism conference every year in Melbourne. And she says, we need to liberate people in new and amazing ways that can only be imagined today, if only we cast off the shackles of heteronormativity. What's that? Creation. God made them male and female. We're going to go through creation ordinance over the next 2 days, and we're going to see that God revealed that as creator. Another thing that's always oppressive, women and children is now an oppression. The fact that women have children and women care for children, which most women still do, but that's oppressive because, of course, we don't like women serving families and kids. We want them to serve employers instead, because that's so much more fulfilling. And the UN calls it the motherhood penalty. The fact that if women have children, they're held back in life. I mean, what a pile of rubbish. There's nothing more obvious in the Bible that is so wrong, and that actually the idea that a woman is a mother is one of the most profound truths in Scripture. And it's one of the most dignifying things. In fact, the Apostle Paul seems to say it's the reason she doesn't get the blame for the fall. But anyway, he doesn't quite say that. Well, but if you read it, it sounds like it. This is all wrong. It's an attack on creation. Even the whole racism thing, you've got to understand, it's interesting to me that that's another thing that's actually resolved in creation, race. They will say that race is one of the most significant things about a person. Whereas, of course, I would say, well, it's not significant, that they're still a person, right? Personhood is the significant thing. That's, again, something that's resolved in creation. And so I could go on. I mean, all of these things are creation realities, and it's just interesting. It must be satanic. It must be from the pit of hell, because it is targeting systematically the truth that God is creator and the creation ordinances that he baked into his world for our blessing. That's unfortunately where we are today. The other quick one I'll do is postmodernism. I just want to say this about postmodernism. Postmodernism is one of the things it achieved was that it helped to achieve with other ideas, was that it killed the idea of objective truth. So that now so the idea that there's truth for all, and now it's all just your truth and my truth, and truth is all subjective, and I'll live my truth and all the rest of it. What that really has done, and this is one of the best critiques I've ever heard, is that it killed the author. It killed the author of truth. It killed God who made truth for all. It killed the source of truth. Again, that's a satanic idea. And it reigns today. It has done a number on our culture. Now, we've got 25 minutes, 35 minutes left. Maybe we should take a break, I think. All right, the next point I just want to make is this. The passage in Romans 1 does make the point that for all this that we've been describing, God does hold people responsible. And there's a couple of reasons for that. In verse 21, it says this startling thing. It says, although they knew God, they did not honour him as God or give thanks to him. And one of the things that Romans 1 and 2 also says, Romans 2 says that their conscience bears witness to truth. It actually makes a point that people do know that there's someone more, there's a God. It's interesting, it's like the old joke about the atheist. He says, the atheist has said in his heart, there is no God, and I hate him. And you laugh because it's kind of true. But here's another thing that I found interesting. There's been quite a lot of research done. Children believe in God. Did you know that? It's a natural thing. It's normal for a kid. They just accept it. They believe it quite naturally. At some point, people choose not to believe. And that could be through all sorts of complicated means. But the assertion here is that they choose not to. And one of the ways in which we can know that people choose not to, according to this passage, is verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. Note this, so they are without excuse. Can you believe that on Judgment Day, God will say that to somebody? He will say, you have no excuse. I was clearly evident to you in the things that have been made. The point here is that there is not an evidence problem for God. The point is, the issue is, it's a human problem. It's a human heart, a human nature problem. You say, well, how sufficient is the evidence? Well, so sufficient as this, or as obvious as this. The building we're in right now was not the result of an explosion in a Bunnings warehouse. Right? No one just got the materials in a big heap and ignited it and said, I hope we get a building. Chance, random processes don't do what we see when we look out that window. Do you know, I was walking, I went on holidays to Flinders Island on the northeast of Tasmania because I wanted to get away from the world and see nobody for a week, and I didn't. And I was walking along the most deserted beach I have ever been on. And I came across a chair that had been made out of driftwood. And it was quite odd because I was walking along this absolute desolation and I was like, there's a full-on chair. And there was no houses around or anything, but someone had actually made a chair and stuck it on a rock as if it was their sitting spot. And it had been made out of driftwood and wired together. Now I didn't sit there and go, look what the tide made. Straight away I went, oh, there's somebody else that's been here. There's someone around. Someone sits here. Now I saw a sign of intelligence. And here's the thing, we see the fingerprints of intelligent minds on things that demonstrate order and complexity. Actually, the hundreds of years of intellect that has to go into the sort of engineering expertise and the collective minds and disciplines that are put into something as simple as this building is quite remarkable to think about. Now, it's kind of obvious when you see it. You go, oh, nice, there's a lovely building. Someone built it. How much more are the fingerprints of God on creation, which an infinity of human minds can never hope to plumb the depths of? It is that obvious, and people live their whole lives surrounded by that truth, and they never answer the question. But it is the question that so many so-called intellects grapple with and have done for a very long time. I mean, as just one example, and there are many possible examples. In fact, this has been going on. Why is there something rather than nothing for probably millennia? But here's one example. I was listening to an interview on the radio a while ago, and it was an interview with a guy who was working in Switzerland on this thing called the Large Hadron Collider. This great big science experiment, this tunnel that's under the Swiss Alps or whatever, and they're firing particles at each other to try and do scientific experiments. And they were interviewing this guy about some of the work they were doing, and this guy was sort of saying, at the time, he was saying, we're searching for something called the Higgs boson, and they were saying, describe it for us. It was interesting. It was really interesting to hear his description of it. He said, well, this is the thing that infused the Big Bang with power. I thought, okay, he's looking for something very powerful. He's looking for energy. He said, this is also the thing, of course, that ignited the beginning in that fashion. It was the thing that was there right before there were things, if that makes any sense. And I thought, that's interesting. He's looking for the thing that was there from the beginning. He's looking for something that has energy, that has power. And then he said, yeah, and we've nicknamed it God particle. And I just thought to myself, well, here we go. And all I could think of was Romans, where he says, what are the things that are clearly seen ever since the creation of the world? Eternity. That's what he was looking for, right? Power. And the bit where they stumble is divine nature. There is eternity. There is something that was there at the start. There is power. There is something that started it off and that sustains it by power. And you know what? It's something that is divine. God says that's obvious. People, high-powered intellects search into these things and they're blinded because they have parked the answer at one side and they look for other answers instead. Now, that's not to say the Higgs boson isn't real. I mean, they did find it. They have defined a Higgs boson. What I'm saying is this was a guy who was undertaking a godless endeavour and he was denying the ultimate answer, which was God. I actually was doing an interview with somebody in the UK a while ago, and I was talking to him about this very thing. He said, that's actually how I became a Christian. He said, I was camping on a school camp, and he said, we were lying outside and I was looking at the stars, and he said, I just said, God, I know you're real, because how else could this be? And he said, please show me who you are. And one thing led to another, and a year later he became a Christian. Because God answers that prayer. It's just amazing for me to hear what is obvious. And one of the things I can't believe is that people who live in some of the most beautiful places on the planet, like Switzerland and Norway, these are some of the most secular countries. And I think, how? Psalm 19, It says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And here's the interesting thing about Psalm 19. It says, night unto night pour forth speech. They pour forth speech. There are no words. Their words are heard, or their words go out to the ends of the earth. And you go, well, hang on, there are no words. Their words go out to the end of the earth. Doesn't make any sense. It does. What he's saying is they're not speaking, but they're speaking. In other words, there's no actual verbal speech. But when you look at them, you say, I see God. Now, can I just say, you're not the fool for saying that. They're the fools who say you're a fool, because it is really that obvious. And I don't know how else to put it. And when I was studying science at uni, I used to bash my head against the wall thinking, people just don't want to hear it. It's so obvious, but they don't want to hear it. They're blinded. They're suppressing that truth because they want to. And you might say, well, why do people want to do this? Why do we want to suppress the truth about God? What's the desire here? Where's it coming from? I tell you, this section of the Bible tells us that because God is competition for us. That's really what it comes down to. Because either we do what is right in our own eyes. We talked about this yesterday, remember? I say what is right and wrong for me. I define who I am, what I do, my truth. I make myself as God, as we read in Genesis, as you read in Genesis chapter 3. Either that's how we live, or we can't. We have to submit to one who is greater, who sits in that throne and that place instead of us. And that's why verse 25 says they exchanged the truth about God for, actually in the original it is the lie, the truth for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. The ultimate creature worship is worshipping and serving the self. And that's really what our culture is in the throes of right now. Self-indulgence, we talked about identity, we talked about the rise of, you and self, and, I just think it's so toxic. And it's something we've really got to untrain ourselves from. But here's how far people are prepared to go in this matter. I used to wonder why the Apostle Paul suddenly launches into this confronting discussion of homosexuality at this point. And he's making a very important and relevant point. He's saying people are going so far that they're competing with God for his status as creator. Notice the word he uses is creator. And then he says, well, speaking of creation, and the example he uses, and excuse me being direct for a second, but he says that when it comes to the question of sexuality, there's nothing clearer than the fact that God has made male and female a certain way so that they interact with each other in a certain way. That's creation. There are certain things that work and certain things that don't actually work from a creation point of view. He says, can you believe people have got to the point where they've said, I don't care. I'm the creator now. I'm going to make it work anyway. Now, we're living in a time now where it's gone to another level, although even in those days this was around. But the whole gender fluidity thing. I mean, honestly, I could say I'm 6'7" with hairy hands, but I'm a woman and I'm beautiful, and you'll say that it is true, or I will sue you. This is saying I'm the creator now. Not just my truth in the small things, but in the greatest thing of all. I'm competing with God for creation. I'm saying what is real about the world, what is true about the world. And it kind of takes us back to the discussion we had before about the all-out attack right now in our time on creation, the things that have been made. And God Creator is really being undermined. This is the moment that we find ourselves in. And then you say, well, okay, that's what people are doing. That's the enterprise we're all engaged in. By the way, it's the enterprise we're all being tempted with. Not all of us are out there saying God isn't real because I don't see him in creation, but a lot of us are living the way we want to live. A lot of us prefer our own feelings and our own desires and our own wants and our own view of the world over what, say, the Word of God says. It's pretty common. And we spend a lifetime unpicking that and changing ourselves in light of that. It's the same impulse, not submitting to what God has said. That is the human problem. And even after you're converted, it's what you wrestle with as you change and sanctify over time. And the context here from the beginning was, of course, the wrath of God is revealed against these things. I want to make a comment about that. he's not primarily talking about the fact that there will be judgment in the future. Really what he's saying is, because all of this is true, the world's a mess. And that is actually a revelation of the wrath of God. The fact that God says, oh, that's what you want? I will give you over to it. The fact that he does that is judgment. And it's judgment now. It's amazing to me as we watch so many of these cultural changes particularly intensify in recent years. I mean, it's always been the human condition, but I think there's been a real intensification, particularly around the attack on creation in recent times. One of the things that doesn't seem to get that much attention is the fact that we are more depressed and more anxious than we have ever been in our society's history. We're a mess. Young people in particular, I forget the numbers now. I looked at stats for young women in particular in America over the last 10 years. It's unbelievable. And you sit there and go, well, what is happening? Well, lots of things are changing. And the center of gravity of so much of these changes are what we've been reading right now. Proverbs says the way of the transgressor is hard. And people deny that big time. But it is true. I want to say this. People will complain these days about we often blame others because of this whole oppression and victim narrative, It's always someone else's fault why we are what we are. And one of the things we do is that we claim that all these things are oppressive. And I mentioned some of them before, even the creation things. The fact is there is nothing more oppressive than sin. There is nothing that will harm you. There is nothing that will cause you a pain more than sin, regret, guilt. I remember not that long ago, there was a billboard. It was on the side of a bus. There was an advertising campaign where they put these signs on the sides of buses. And all it said was a heart beats at 4 weeks. It was a pro-life message. And I remember the New South Wales Transport Minister, Andrew Constance, had the billboard banned. And in the discussion of why that was so, one of the things that was raised, this message could make women feel guilty. I sit there and think, well, hang on a second. If we're the creators now and we say what's right and wrong, why would people feel guilty? Well, it's the same thing, right? It's because it's a reminder. It's a reminder of what we know to be true. I mean, I can't imagine that people who are made, women who are made to have children in God's design, can do such a thing and not be plagued by it, and not have it cause them great hardship. I have no doubt, and they kind of proved it, didn't they, when they said this? Oh, this is going to make people guilty. Well, yeah, because there's truth here, and this is what is being suppressed. And when it talks about the wrath of God being revealed, the fact is the way of the transgressor is hard. And it's not a message of, I always hasten to add, it's not the end of the road for anybody. Because the amazing thing is that Jesus died for every sin, and there is restoration. But without that, this is what you get. Without that, this is the culture that grows up around you and the way people think. What has happened here, of course, is that people have got it wrong from the start. And in the little things, we so often get it wrong from the start. Because we fail to begin where we're supposed to begin. We fail to begin with God. Because that's the truth about all things, is that God is behind it somewhere and has something to say about it. I used to own, I quite like cars, and if I'd gone into a legal career, I'd probably be driving a fast one by now. And one of the things that I had when I was at uni was a Lamborghini branded laptop. And it was made out of carbon fibre. The palm rest was leather with yellow Lamborghini stitching. It had an actual Lamborghini badge on the top. And here's the funny bit. When you turned it on, it revved like a Lamborghini engine. It was a great laptop. It was really high quality. It was very high performing. And it was all Lamborghini. And this thing had a lot of firepower. It was actually the most powerful laptop on the market. I spent a lot of money on it. And I remember one day I was typing away on that machine as fast as I could, bashing out notes. And my finger somehow went under one of the keys or something. And as I lifted my finger, the E key popped right off. And it snapped. And I was sitting there with this keyboard and all these letters and this computer with all this firepower, but I had no E key. That's a bit of an issue. There's not a lot you can say or do on a computer without an E-key of any substance. You can click buttons on the internet, but beyond that it gets very hard. And you've got to type with your mouse, clicking the on-screen keyboard or something like this, because touch screens weren't a thing back then, believe it or not. And I thought to myself, isn't that, there's a metaphor or something here. There's a lot of firepower involved. There's a lot of things that this machine is capable of, but it's got a fatal flaw. In fact, the simplest of replies can't be written. Yes, there's no E. And I just look at the situation here and I think what's being said here is that the world has thrown out the E key. The world has taken the most important piece and it has thrown it out the window and it said no to God. And having said no to God, everything else starts to progressively fall apart because they're starting in the wrong place. And of course, when the evidence of that starts to bubble up, we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. We go on saying, nope, we're right. We don't want to hear about it. That is the state of our society. Now, we are called, and this is really where it comes full circle to our situation, we are called in all things to be totally different, to put the right foundation back in place and to actually think right. We're called back to that first statement of the Bible, in the beginning God. It's not just a philosophical idea, it's the truth about everything. And so if we want to understand everything and act rightly, it's where we start fundamentally in all things. In our living, in our actions, in our behaviours, in our work, everything. And again, we school ourselves over a lifetime for this. But I mentioned yesterday at the start of my talk that example where the girl in the youth group said, "Can you just teach us how to think?" And the whole room went, "Yeah, teach us how to think." And I was kind of blindsided and I thought, I don't even know what to say. Now I know what I would say. I would just say, in the beginning, God. That's how you think. That's how you reason well. And when the answer is given to us in Romans 1, 16 and 17, that's really what's happening. The Apostle Paul is saying, let's go back to first principles. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And you see now he's got a reason not to be ashamed because he sees how great it is in light of the mess that's all around us. And what does the gospel do? Well, it's the gospel of God, he calls it earlier in the chapter. And he says, in the gospel is the power of God. He says, I start with him and I start with his power. And what we learn as he describes and unpacks that over 16 chapters, the first thing he is anxious to say is that God is the creator. God made things and he's given us the blueprints of what they're for and how they work. I said, I'm so grateful for that in an age of total confusion that we've been given such clarity and it's such a blessing. And I want other people to know that blessing. It begins with God, creator. And I would say this as well. With the undermining of creation and some certain failures around that in the last 200 years, I guess, one of the things that we were a bit too quick to give up on in the church was the idea of God creator. We said, well, all right, maybe that's all a lot of baloney. We don't really know. The main thing is we need to talk about God the Saviour. But of course, if God didn't create, then what's the point of God saving, right? We've got to have both. And the Apostle Paul certainly begins with God and the fact that he is the creator. But then, of course, he goes on and he says he's the Saviour. And he says it is the gospel of Jesus Christ that is the most important thing in the world because remember from the start we said the problem is a spiritual problem. We can never lose sight of that. And we'll learn a lot in this life and much of the learning we face in a secular world won't go that far. And that's why it's our job as Christians in this world to be the ones who are evangelists first. And that is the part of our vocation that we never let go of and which is common to every single one of us. And that gospel that we believe in, it takes us right through from our own conversion to our view of the world, as we've just described, but also it takes us right through to Romans 12. This is still Paul's book about the gospel. He says there's another way in which the righteousness of God is revealed. By the way, that's an interesting way to describe the gospel, isn't it? In it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Ever heard anyone say that? What's the gospel? Oh, it's the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. I've never heard anyone say it. Paul does. And it's interesting to me, all of a sudden I see why that's such a precious thing, because God's righteousness, surely that's what the world is suffering without. And of course, that's what he gives the world, but it's what he gives you as well. And that's the enlightenment he gives you, and he gives you the power to do it and to embrace it and to follow it by faith. But also from chapter 12, what he's actually saying is the righteousness of God is revealed through your transformed life. That's the testimony you take into a godless world, is that your life is different. Because you started with God, including the gospel, it's changed you, and you're there to change others. That's really the life to which each of us is called. And you know what? That's actually the means by which God has ordained to change the world. That's how he does it. Just by you, in your place, doing that. That's how he will change your world and turn it from what it is to what it could be.